This is your whole grains mega video. In this video, we are diving into the wonderful world of whole grains. And this is absolutely key if you want to nail the Mediterranean diet approach to eating. So by the end of this video, you're going to have mastered these concepts. What is a whole grain? What are the top 5 whole grains that you should be including in your Mediterranean diet menu? We'll do a tutorial of how to cook quinoa and a tutorial of how to cook farro, 2 of my favorite whole grains. We're going to talk about the concept of the glycemic index and what that means for your health. And then we'll discuss a little bit about gluten and who should be considering a gluten-free diet. And I'll talk to you about what a gluten-free Mediterranean diet approach looks like. So by the end of this video, you are going to be a superstar with whole grains. Hey there, I'm Dr. Anna. I'm a medical doctor. I was trained in Italy. And on this channel, you're gonna learn how to master your health. Okay, let's dive right in. Up first, we're going to describe what a whole grain is and what is the nutrition of whole grains. Now, what exactly are whole grains? Well, a lot of us know grains for the flour that we get from them when we mill it down. And we use this flour for things like bread and pasta and cookies and crackers and cakes. Well, if we take it back a step and think about how these foods come from nature and the plant forms that they grow in, grains are actually the seeds of grasses. And another name for grains are cereals. And I'm not just talking about cereals the way that they are manufactured and packaged to us in a form of a breakfast cereal. I'm talking about cereals from the whole plant form. So it turns out these little kernels are supercharged with nutrition and extremely beneficial to our health. So let's go over the nutrition of whole grains. Well, depending on the variety, some factors might differ. Some grains might have a little bit more fiber than others. Some might be a little bit more nutrient dense, meaning has a little bit more vitamins and minerals than others, but all of them generally provide us a very healthy source of complex carbohydrates. And these carbohydrates, as mentioned, are going to provide us with fiber. And fiber is that bulk component of food that's really important for healthy digestion. It allows the bacteria inside of our gut to thrive, to be as healthy as possible. And that's really important because the gut bacteria are really important for your digestive health and your immune system. And it also turns out we're learning more and more every day from scientific studies of the role that this microbiota plays in our health. It does impact other organ systems like our hormonal systems and our nervous system. So what are some of the main nutrients that we get from whole grains? Well, some of these are going to be vitamins, particularly vitamin A, vitamin E, and many different kinds of B vitamins. B1, 2, 3, 6, 9. A bunch of them are in there. And then we also have some minerals. So this is going to be things like iron, magnesium, phosphorus, or selenium, just to name a few. And then what about that thing called gluten? Well, a lot of you have probably heard about gluten because a gluten-free diet is so commonplace in societies because we know that gluten is a really big problem for some people who have conditions like celiac disease, where they have an autoimmune condition, and those people cannot really ingest any gluten. And then other people might have a direct allergy to gluten, and some people just feel crummy when they eat it. So for certain folks, a gluten-free diet is the way they want to go. But gluten is not inherently something bad for us. It is actually a protein found in a lot of types of grains, things like wheat or barley, for example. And if you're curious to understand a little bit more about gluten and want to see what an approach to the Mediterranean diet would look like if you are gluten-free, I have a cool video for you up here where I break all of that down, so you can check that out after if you're interested. So next, we're going to turn our attention to different types of grains that we could incorporate into our diet. But before we jump into that, I'd like you to please subscribe to this channel. Believe it or not, your subscription helps get this material out to more people who really deserve to learn it. Okay, so this video is all about whole grains. Well, what does it really mean for a grain to be whole? Well, as we discussed in the very beginning, grains, when they come from their natural plant form, are actually the seeds of grasses. So a whole grain is going to be the entire kernel of a seed, and it's going to have a very rough outer coating, and then the inside is going to have a lot more nutrition and a little bit of the softer material. And that's where the starchy part comes from that we can use for making flours into baked goods. So how do they make flour exactly? Well, they take those whole grain forms and they mill it down or break it up into making that really soft material that we call flour. And not all flours are created equal. Flour that comes from the whole grain kernel that has no parts removed is, of course, a whole grain flour. That's why we have things like whole wheat flour, where the entire kernel of the grain is still included when they're milling down that flour. But other times, we actually remove that outer tough coating so that we can create what's called the white flour or the refined flour. The goal is to get a really soft texture to the flour. And that kind of a flour is going to be really important for things like soft pastries or cakes, anything very delicate. And when you remove some of that tough outer coating of a grain, you are actually removing some of the nutrition. You're removing a lot of the fiber and the vitamins and minerals. Not all of it, just a lot of it. So what's the deal with refined grains? Well, we know that refining flour and making that flour then into other baked goods, for example, is a process that we're removing some of the nutrition. And if we eat too much food with too much refined flours, that's actually just going to cause us to have a bigger spike in our blood sugar. Because basically by removing the fiber and the minerals and the vitamins, we're only leaving behind the carbohydrate, which is the form of sugar. So having too much of this in our diet overall, we know does have consequences on our health, but it doesn't mean you have to eliminate it entirely. It's all about keeping it in check. So then what about some of these other terms we throw around? Things like enriched grains or fortified grains. So that is where a manufacturer is going to then add some nutrition back in to a flour that's been refined. Sometimes manufacturers add even more nutrients, vitamins or minerals, than the grain naturally has. And this is important because there are certain nutrients like iron or folate, for example, where a lot of people can be deficient. And so by enriching foods that we commonly buy in the grocery store, like breads or breakfast cereals, we know that most of the population is at least getting a good amount. But don't be concerned about the term fortified or enriched if you see that on a food nutrition label. It just means that they added some nutrients back. All right, so I mentioned before that there are many benefits to our health of eating lots of whole grains. So what are some of these benefits? Well, we know that eating a lot of fiber is good for our digestive health, and it's also good for our cardiovascular health and our immune system. So some of the known benefits of eating a diet rich in whole grains are that it improves our cardiovascular health. It's going to help decrease the risk for atherosclerosis. In other words, that fatty plaque buildup that can happen inside of our blood vessels and then lead to things like heart attacks or strokes. It's also good at helping to improve our cholesterol levels, which are also an independent risk factor for that heart disease. Whole grains are also known to help lower blood pressure. And because of all of the fiber in whole grains, they help us to feel really full after eating a meal, which is very important for our blood sugar regulation and just feeling good after we eat. And I don't know about you, but I don't like the feeling of being hungry, especially not just an hour or 2 hours after I've eaten a meal. In general, we're trying to eat for energy so we can go forward in life and do other things besides eating. Now, a diet rich in whole grains, which inevitably means a diet with pretty adequate amounts of fiber, is also going to help for things like type 2 diabetes and even some types of cancer, like colorectal cancer. So if you're listening to this and you're feeling really excited about eating more whole grains, comment below and share with us which types of whole grains do you like to eat the best? Which ones are you already incorporating into your diet? And which ones are you kind of afraid to eat or you're not really sure how to eat? If you jump in the comments below and tell me, then I'm able to make more videos that can help address your specific questions. And now let's turn our attention to the top 5 whole grains that you should include in your Mediterranean diet menu. Here are my top 5 favorite whole grains. Coming in at 5th place, we have farro. So what is farro? Some of you may not have even heard of this. Well, this is an ancient grain that comes from the Middle East and is a part of a very traditional Italian diet. It is said that farro is actually the original wheat grain. And what's cool about farro is that it is such a rich source of nutrition. It has a sort of chewy texture, and we usually cook it like a pasta. So it's boiled in water, we can add some flavorings, and it's going to provide a little bit of a nuttiness to it. Now, I love farro for so many reasons, but one of the main reasons is because it is so nutrient dense. So farro has a lot of fiber in it, which is similar to a lot of the other whole grains on this list. But what's kind of unique about farro is it actually provides a decent amount of protein. Like the other whole grains on this list, farro is going to provide us some good nutrition in the form of vitamins and minerals, and also some phytonutrients, which are special nutrients that are found in plants, known to have anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory properties. The cool thing about Pharaoh is that it is so versatile. You can put it on a salad, you can make it into a bowl, you can throw it into soup, or you could even eat it plain as a side along with the rest of your meal. So if you want to see a little tutorial for how to actually cook this, you can walk through my step-by-step tutorial on how to cook Pharaoh. And if you are really interested in seeing an example recipe of something you can throw together with Pharaoh that just takes 5 minutes, I do have another video up here where I create a very simple 5-minute Pharaoh salad. What's cool is that you can take the idea from this Pharaoh salad and make your own iteration of it by changing up the vegetables you put in it, changing the flavors, things like herbs and spices added. The beauty of greens is that they can acquire any flavor of anything that you add to it. So coming in at 4th place, we have rice. Now, rice has more varieties than I could ever possibly name in this video. You're going to see things like short grain and long grain rice. There's white rice, and then there's brown rice, wild rice that can come in different varieties of red or even black colors. We have some kinds of rice that can be created into risotto. There is just so much you can do with rice. And a lot of different cultures around the world have some kind of a rice in their cuisine, especially the ancient cuisines of the world. Rice is found in South American cuisines, North American cuisines, European cuisines, African cuisines, Asian cuisines, Australia probably. I mean, I think I just named the entire world. So you get the idea. There's a lot of varieties of rice. Now, when it comes to the nutrition of rice, it's going to also provide us a good bit of fiber. And different varieties of rice are going to have different qualities in them. They might have a different flavor profile from one to another, maybe slightly different mineral content, which can also depend on the quality of the soil that the rice plants are grown in. The cool thing about rice is that just like with our 5th place Pharaoh, it's so versatile. You can throw rice into soup. You could have a rice bowl. You could have rice on a salad, or rice can just be the bed of your meal that you put other things on top of, like meat or roasted vegetables. You can get as creative as you want with rice. One of my favorite things to eat has always been a rice pudding. Now, rice pudding has a few different varieties, but one of my favorites that I've ever had is an old Persian recipe, and it has rose water in it and even some cinnamon. And I know you can add any kind of chopped nuts like almond or vanilla. The flavors are just so beautiful together. Another family favorite of ours has always been chicken soup with rice. And if any of you have ever read the children's book, Chicken Soup with Rice, you're going to know what a fantastic comfort food this is. Rice is just one of those things that you can probably put with absolutely any kind of food that you want. Rice is great with a vegan meal. It's great with a meat meal. It's great with eggs. It's great with beans. It's great with vegetables of any variety. You pretty much just can't go wrong with rice. And that's why it is one of the staples on my list and in my diet. Now, we have to put this little caveat in here. A lot of people claim that white rice is inferior to other kinds of rice, like a wild rice or a brown rice. But here's my thought on this. While yes, something like a white rice is probably going to be higher in its starch content and maybe lower in fiber, I don't think that the difference between the white and the brown rice is that significant that it's going to affect your overall health, unless that's pretty much the only whole grain that you eat. If you're eating a balanced diet with a good amount of variety, and sometimes you have rice, but other times you just have other kinds of foods, then I don't really think white rice is going to be that big of a deal. And here's the other thing about this. People claim that because it is a high glycemic index food, that this is so bad for your metabolic health. But I challenge you to question whether someone is ever eating plain rice and that's their entire meal, or are they eating that rice alongside other foods that might contain fat, fiber, and protein, my healthy trifecta that I like to promote, because it helps slow down digestion of things like carbohydrates so that our blood sugar doesn't spike too fast. Now, if what I just said is kind of confusing, I encourage you to check out a lot of other videos on my channel where I dive a little bit more into the concept of metabolism and why certain nutrients like fiber, fat, and protein are important for our metabolic health. But the take-home message here is I'm not really convinced that there's such a significant difference in our overall health if you eat white rice versus brown rice. I think you should probably just eat the one that you like. At the end of the day, both of them classify as a whole grain and thus are pretty good for you. Now, another cool thing about rice is that when I lived in Milan, Italy, there were so many mosquitoes in the summer, and it has a pretty humid climate in the summertime. And I always wondered why that is. because it is sitting at the base of the Alpine mountains where you should have a good amount of fresh air rolling through, as well as having a little bit of sea breeze coming up over the Liguria region just to the south. But the truth is that the Lombardy region of Italy has so many rice paddies. It's actually pretty flat, and they grow a lot of different kinds of rice in that part of Italy. And if any of you are from a country that also grows a lot of rice, you may realize that there's a lot of mosquitoes, because mosquitoes love standing water, and water that's just kind of standing is exactly the kind of environment that rice likes to grow in. So it's a little bit of a downside of living in a place that grows a lot of rice, is that it's going to have a lot of humidity and probably a lot of mosquitoes. All right, if you're liking this video so far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because believe it or not, it actually helps a lot of other people access these videos. And I think a lot of people deserve to learn this information. Thanks for being a part of our community. All right, in third place, for my top 5 whole grains, we're gonna have whole wheat. This one's probably not such a shocker. Wheat is one of those things that is so versatile in the way we can use it in our diet. Wheat is one of the main grains that is milled down into a flour. And flour, of course, can be used to bake anything. It can be made into pasta, dough for maybe making bread, pizza dough, or baked goods like pies and cakes and cookies and delicious things. When it comes to the Mediterranean diet, we are all about eating healthy, balanced foods and saving desserts for special occasions. But if we have the option to use a flour that is of a whole wheat variety, it is that much better for our health overall. Now, whole wheat is very nutrient dense. It can come with some vitamin E, a good amount of fiber, lots of different minerals. And there are so many ways that you can actually eat this besides flour. You can eat the whole wheat berries that are these little balls of grain, and you boil them much like you would boil any other grain. These have a sort of tough texture, and I think they go really well in a soup, in a stew, or tossed into a grain bowl with lots of other vegetables and healthy proteins. But here's where people kind of get tripped up when it comes to wheat. There's a lot of wheat flour that's super refined and then used in products that have a lot of added sugar, processed oils, added salt, unhealthy ingredients, you name it. And I think this is part of what gives wheat such a bad reputation. There are some people who have allergies and serious sensitivities to wheat or gluten, but I don't think it's fair to say that just because a lot of people have sensitivities, that means we need to rule wheat out entirely. It is also the case that wheat coming from different parts of the world is going to be of a slightly different quality. Now, that in and of itself is a huge topic that I am not going to dive into on this video. I will perhaps in future videos try to study that and give you guys a video about it. So if you're curious for that, comment below and let me know. But as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to be buying a grocery store product that is made from wheat, as much as possible, try to either buy the whole wheat berries themselves and eat those in your diet, or buy a product that is 100% whole wheat flour. If you can't find something like that, it is totally fine to get something that says whole wheat on it, but just make sure you understand the difference. Any label on a product that says made from whole wheat or made from whole grains is not necessarily a whole wheat product, because any flour from wheat that's going to be used for any product had to originally come from whole wheat, and then they mill it down and refine it and extract some of the important nutrients like the fiber to make it a certain texture, which is better in some baked goods, for example. So claiming that something is made from whole grains or made from whole wheat is next to meaningless. So just make sure to pay attention to that the next time you're in the grocery store. And another thing to pay attention to is that a lot of baked goods or breads are going to have lots of different added ingredients to help stabilize them on the shelf. In other words, make them have a longer shelf life. And one of the things that they add is sugar and refined oils in order to maintain that these foods are not going to get moldy as fast. Now just pay attention, because that can be really convenient, but it's not necessarily as good for our health overall. The goal in the Mediterranean diet, and I'd argue really any healthy eating approach, is to eat as fresh of foods as possible. So if we're eating bread that's been in the bag for already 3 weeks and it still doesn't have mold, we should probably be asking ourselves why. All right, what's my favorite whole grain in second place? Well, this is going to be oats. Now, oats are one of those things that are, again, this is very redundant in this video, but very versatile in our diet. We can eat oats plain and cooked into oatmeal, made into things like crunchy granola, or tossed into smoothies. And then there are oat extracted things. We have like oat milk. And oats are also really good for our skin. The grain Avena sativa is actually super nourishing from a dermatologic standpoint. And so oat-based creams and cleansers can be really gentle on the skin. In any case, oats are one of those things that are generally pretty cheap and is probably one of the easiest ways for people to get more fiber into their diet. Oats have a decent amount of iron, and I find that the flavor is just so nice and nutty. And there are also lots of varieties of oats. You can get steel cut oats, you could get rolled oats, or you can just get plain oats. And oats are also really fun for baking. One of my favorite things to make are little energy balls that have a little bit of nuts or nut butters and maybe some seeds and some oats, so that if I'm really pressed for time and I don't have a way to have a healthy snack, I just grab one of those and I'm on my way. And if any of you have recipes for these, please comment below and share with us, because I would love to see how some of you use oats in your diet, or for that matter, any of the whole grains on this list. Okay, drum roll please. And our first place winner for my list of my favorite whole grains is quinoa. Okay, quinoa. What's the deal? Is it a grain? Is it not a grain? Well, actually, it's not technically a grain. Quinoa is a pseudo grain because it's technically a seed. Quinoa is cool because it has a lot of protein for being a grain, and it cooks in a very short amount of time. I find that quinoa is one of the easiest things to add to my diet overall. I put it on a salad. Sometimes I use it as a replacement to oatmeal, or I toss it into a stew or a soup. So you can see that it's pretty versatile. And now I mentioned that it has a decent amount of protein. For a serving of quinoa, which is about a cup of cooked quinoa, it'll give you about 8 grams of protein. Now that's not half bad for being a grain, which is pretty much a carbohydrate food. Actually, what's cool about quinoa is it's sort of a mixed food, much like a nut or a seed would be. Now I have seen some people be super creative and fancy when it comes to ways to use quinoa in the diet. There are things like quinoa burgers, quinoa patties, or putting quinoa in a breakfast bowl with yogurt, nuts, seeds, and fruit. You could just Google around and start looking up quinoa recipes, and I'm sure you're going to learn something new. And for those of you who are not quite sure how to cook quinoa, I have an easy tutorial that I walk you through step by step how to cook this. Okay, strap on that apron. We're jumping into the kitchen. Now you're going to help me cook a little bit of quinoa. First, let's go through what equipment we need in order to do this. Now, cooking quinoa is pretty easy. We're only going to need a pot with a lid. It can be small or large depending on how much you're going to make. We need a colander or a fine mesh strainer. We're going to need a fork. You'll need a liquid measuring cup. Or if you prefer, you can measure your quinoa and your water by weight, which is the way a lot of countries in Europe do it. So you can use a scale. And then finally, we're going to need a cutting board with a knife, and ideally 2 types of knives, a chopping knife and a serrated knife, and that'll be a little bit for later when we throw the quinoa into that Mediterranean diet bowl. So we can set the knife and the cutting board to the side for now. And by the way, if you need to get any of this equipment, or if you're looking to boost up the equipment you have in your kitchen for easier cooking, especially healthy cooking, I have a bunch of links in the description below to my favorite cooking tools that I use all the time. So you can check that out if you're interested. All right, then how about the ingredients we need to cook quinoa? Well, like I said before, quinoa is one of the easiest grains to cook. And all we need is the quinoa and water. That's it. So unlike rice, where some people add flavorings and oil into it while it's cooking, I always think it's better to just keep the quinoa plain and you can flavor it later. So the kind of quinoa I'm going to be using today is this tricolor quinoa. You can see it has sort of light color and dark color mixed together. And that's just for a little bit of variety, but you could buy just the blonde color, just the red quinoa, or just the dark quinoa. They can sell it in those varieties as well. Now, where can you buy quinoa? So quinoa is not technically a grain. It's actually a pseudo grain, or is a type of seed. But usually in your grocery store, you will find it in the health food aisle. Maybe your grocery store carries it in the section where there's rice and pasta and beans. So check out those places in your local grocery store if you've never bought quinoa before and you're not sure where to find it. But because it's not really a typical thing that's found in every kind of a grocery store, you might have some trouble. Now, if you can't find it in your local grocery store, don't worry. I have a link in the description below for you for how to buy it online from Amazon. So feel free to go ahead and grab that if you need it. So now that we know what equipment we need and we have our list of ingredients, which are just 2, we're ready to get started with the process. So here's where we need to start. We need to understand the ratio of water to quinoa. Now, a lot of the times different grains, so rice or whole wheat berries or oats, are going to have slightly different proportions depending on their cooking time and how much water they absorb. Quinoa gets fluffy when it's cooked, but it does not absorb that much water. So different recipes might alter the amount of water that they recommend to put with quinoa. The ratio that I found works the best is just under a 2-to-1 ratio. So what that means is less than 2 cups for every 1 cup of quinoa. Or if you're going by the metric scale, you can still do the same proportions. So what I'm going to do is take about 1 3/4 cup of water to 1 cup of quinoa. Okay, so now that we understand how much water we wanna have and how much quinoa we wanna have, let's section out the amounts we're going to use. Okay, so like I said, we're going to use a proportion that is 1 3/4 cup of water to 1 cup of quinoa. What I'm going to do is use my liquid measuring cup, which I have here, and you can see on the side, this is up to a 2 cups measurement. So I'm going to go to 1 cup and fill it with the quinoa. Just make sure it comes out level. Okay, so I can see that that's 1 cup. Now I don't just want to dump that into my pot. It's very important with quinoa that you rinse it beforehand for a couple of reasons. First is that it is possible that there could be really tiny pieces of debris or stones that are inside of it, and this is where the small mesh strainer comes in handy. I'm going to do this over the sink so you won't see this in the camera, but what I'm gonna do is put the quinoa in the mesh strainer and I'm just gonna rinse it off a little bit. The other reason that we wanna do this is I've learned before that there are these sort of natural insecticides that the green quinoa produces. The plant itself produces it, and these are called saponins. And so what we wanna do is rinse those off because it can give a little bit of a bitter taste to the quinoa. All right, so I'm going to rinse the grain and then I'm going to refill my liquid measuring cup up to 1 3/4 cups. All right, so I'm going to pour my water to 1 3/4 cup. We're gonna fire up the stove to a medium heat level. I'm going to pour in my water. And then what I'll do is go grab that quinoa that I rinsed. And now we're going to slowly put it into the pot. The thing about quinoa is these little pseudo grains are really tiny when they're uncooked and they can go flying. So if you're not careful, your kitchen might be covered in little quinoas without you realizing it. Oh my goodness, I can already hear them flying around. All right, so what we have now is all of our quinoa inside of that water, and it is going to be coming to a boil. So I have the heat a little bit high, and once it is brought to a boil, I'm going to then reduce the heat to a simmer. And we're going to let it simmer for about 15 minutes with the lid on. Now, while we're waiting for the quinoa to come to a boil, I want you to comment below and share with us, do you usually eat quinoa in a certain way? What are your recipes? Share with us because it helps this community really thrive when we bounce off healthy recipes and other ideas around our community. Now, some people like to have quinoa plain on the side, like a little side of rice. Other people mix it into dishes, or you can sprinkle it on top of so many kinds of things. You can put it on salads, you can put it in soups, you could eat it like oatmeal. There are just a lot of possibilities when it comes to quinoa. Okay, our quinoa is starting to simmer a little bit, almost at a full boil. All right, now we are boiling. So as you can see, that quinoa is at a full rolling boil. We're going to reduce it to a simmer and add the lid. Set the timer to 15 minutes. Believe it or not, I actually have these old school timers in my kitchen. I find that when I try to reach for my phone for a timer, my hands might be sticky, oily, and it's just really too messy to go for the phone. So not a bad thing to keep around. Okay, now that our quinoa is simmering and doing its thing, let's have a little bit of a discussion about the nutrition of quinoa. So quinoa can be sort of a misnomer. People call it a grain because it has a lot of nutrition of whole grains, although it's not technically a grain. It is a seed, so some people call it a pseudo-grain. Now, the thing about quinoa in the Mediterranean diet is that it is not actually native of the Mediterranean region of the world. It comes from South America. But with all the trade that's been going on for hundreds of years, this healthy grain has been incorporated into lots of dishes that are perfect in the Mediterranean diet, but really any approach to eating. So the cool thing about quinoa is that per its weight, compared to a lot of other whole grains, it's higher in its protein content and its fiber content. Not to mention, it still has some vitamins, some minerals, and it has a pretty chewy, nutty texture. So what's wonderful is that if you're somebody who's not eating a lot of meat and you're a strict vegetarian or vegan, or you're just being conscious of how much meat you are consuming, something like quinoa as an addition to your diet, especially on a regular basis, is an easy way to just boost up the protein content even more. Per serving amount, which is a cup of cooked quinoa, it has about 8 grams. Now, that's not to say that it's a high protein food and it should just replace other protein foods, but it's going to give you a little bit of a boost in a really natural way. And notably, I mentioned that quinoa has lots of vitamins and minerals as well. It is a really high source of some minerals like manganese, magnesium, phosphorus, and zinc, and it even has some iron. And then there are also some B vitamins. It has a good amount of vitamin B1, B2, B6, and folate, which is B9. Now, practically speaking, how much quinoa should you eat at a time? The thing about quinoa is that some people do have difficulty digesting it. So if this is a first time for you and you've never had this before, try a really small amount to start. Don't just go for that full serving of a cup. See how your body digests it. If you handle it without any issue, I do recommend going for a full serving at a time, 1 cup cooked. But as is true with most whole grains, the volume expands dramatically when we boil it. That's because it's absorbing all that water. So 1 cup of dry quinoa usually yields anywhere from about 2.5 to 3 cups of cooked quinoa. So that really fluffs up and it expands a lot. The other really fantastic nutrient in quinoa is the fiber component. It has about 5 grams of fiber per serving, which is a cup of cooked quinoa. If a serving of cooked quinoa provides us about 5 grams of fiber, and we know we wanna hit around 28 grams of fiber overall in our day, that is a nice little boost that it's giving us. But if you stick around until we make our amazing Mediterranean quinoa bowl, you're going to see that this is so packed with fiber, you're almost set for your entire day with just this one meal. Okay, so we need to check the quinoa to understand how much time is left for the boiling part. Now it is on a low simmer, but we don't wanna evaporate all of the liquid or have it be absorbed into the quinoa and then burn the bottom of it. All right, there are 3 minutes left on our timer. Let's just check and see where we are with our quinoa. So you can see I'm fluffing it up with a fork. It's definitely nice and fluffy. At the bottom, there's almost no water left. So some stovetops are more powerful than others. We don't want to burn it. So what I'm actually going to do is put the lid back on. So our quinoa is standing for the next 10 minutes with the lid on, heat off. And the goal is to just absorb the last of the liquid. I swear this is the part that makes it so fluffy and delicious. So now that the timer has gone off, let's take a look at our quinoa. Voila. Let's see. Looks pretty good. Ooh, it's so fluffy. Yes. Looks ready to go. So let's remove it from the pot so it can cool. So you can see that the amount of quinoa we started with was 1 cup and it absolutely expanded and we have so much more that we can work with. So without a doubt, this is not the amount for 1 person at 1 meal. This is the amount that I would be cooking for about 3 or 4 people. And if it's the kind of thing where you like to have some leftovers, you could have this as a leftover the following day. And so as long as you eat it within a couple of days, it should be good. In general, we don't want rice to be sitting in the fridge. I do think that the same works for quinoa because we don't want any bacteria to start growing. So as you can see, this quinoa is super fluffy and it is still very hot. So in order for us to make our perfect Mediterranean diet bowl, we are going to let that cool. And now let's turn our attention to a tutorial about how to cook farro. Maybe you clicked on this video because your doctor or your cardiologist has been suggesting that you should be eating the Mediterranean diet for all of its heart healthy properties, for all of the research that's backing it up. And maybe you realize that the Mediterranean diet includes a lot of whole grains and lots of whole-based plant foods as the bulk of the diet. But it can be daunting to figure out what to eat and how to cook these things, and it is especially important to not get bored. And so maybe you're sick of eating rice or you're sick of eating hummus and the same old stuff. Well, I would suggest that farro is one of the best things that ever happened to the Mediterranean diet because it is this really delicious, nutty, chewy grain, and it just happens to have a lot of nutrition and it's really versatile. So think of it like a little bit more of a sturdy rice. In order for us to do this, we need a little bit of equipment that we should go over. What's the first thing you need? Well, in order to cook farro, you're going to basically be cooking it like you would a pasta. So we need to have a pot with a lid, and depending on the amount that you're going to cook, you might want to get a small, medium, or large pot. I like to have a medium pot because I'm cooking for myself and my husband. Then you're going to need some kind of a measuring cup. Now you could use a liquid measuring cup like I have to measure out the amount of farro that you want, or you could weigh it with a scale. It is much more typical in the European system to weigh things by the weight that they are in a recipe than it is to measure by volume. But here in the US, we like to do everything by volume. I really don't know why that is, it's just what it is. Then we're going to need a fork to fluff it up at the end. We will also need a couple of knives and a cutting board. Now at the end of this video, we're going to be throwing this farro into a very easy 5-minute recipe. It's one of my favorite little farro salads that you can make at any time. And in order to do that, we're going to need to chop a little bit of vegetables that are gonna go into that. So we have a knife, ideally 2 types of knives, a big cutting knife and a serrated knife to cut through the skin of tomatoes, and a cutting board. But we're gonna set that to the side for now because we won't need that until the end. By the way, if you need any of this cooking equipment or you're looking to expand the amount of cooking utensils and equipment that you have in your kitchen to better follow healthy eating, I have a few links in the description below to my favorite cooking tools that are my go-to when following not just the Mediterranean diet eating, but any healthy cooking. So you can check out those links if you're interested. Okay, now what are the ingredients that we need to cook farro? Well, like I mentioned before, we can cook farro kind of like we can cook a pasta. We're ultimately going to be boiling it in a bunch of water. So you need water that we're going to get. Then you need your farro itself. For this, you're gonna want some salt that you're gonna throw in, and then you can add some different flavorings to it. What I'm going to be using today is some dried herbs. I have dried oregano and dried rosemary, but you can add other spices. You can add fresh herbs if you'd like. Anything to bring out the nuttiness and the beautiful flavor and texture of farro, and then make it taste like whatever you like. Believe it or not, that's it. That's all you need. This is not difficult, and I know you're going to enjoy this. So let's get started. Okay, so we need to start by understanding what is the ratio of the water or the liquid to the farro. Now, I'm using water today, but you could use a broth, a vegetable broth. Maybe it's a chicken broth or a stock or some kind of a meat stock. Anything that you want to bring out the flavor. I have noticed in my personal experience that using something like broth that naturally is going to have a little bit of oil inside of it slows down the cooking time. So it's just something to be aware of if you're a little bit pressed for time. For me, water has seemed to go faster than broth. Now, how much liquid do you need to use? Without a doubt, farro expands just like any other whole grain would because it's absorbing a lot of water during the cooking. So you need to have a minimum of a 2-to-1 ratio. But I like to cook farro kind of like I would a pasta, where I'm going to put way more water than I need, and I'm just going to boil it and taste test it to know when it's done. And then I'm going to strain off the rest of the water anyway. So I don't really bother with measuring the water as long as I have plenty of water in my pot. So I'm going to start by grabbing that water. Now I'm going to pour a lot of this liquid into my pot. I'm going to bring my water to a boil in the background. I'm gonna turn up that heat, add a bit of salt into the water to help make that boil faster. Put the lid on it So this is a good time to talk about different types of farro. There are 3 different varieties. You could get the whole form like this, or you can get something called semi-pearled or pearled. Now, what's the difference? So whole form farro is going to have the entire grain still intact. It's going to have husk and the bran. What that means is that it's going to have the maximum amount of nutrition inside of it, but also it will take longer to cook. So the nice thing about pearled or semi-pearled is they removed some of those tough parts of the grain, so it's just the fluffy starchy part left, and it's going to have a little bit less nutrition, but the good thing is that it'll cook a lot faster. So usually it takes about 35 to 40 minutes for the whole farro to cook. It will take about 25 to 30 minutes for the semi-pearled farro and about 15 to 20 minutes for the pearled. You can find the different kinds in any health food section or health food store, but just know that it can be tricky to find these things on the shelf in your local grocery store. And because of that, I have links in the description below for all 3 kinds of farro that you can actually buy online on Amazon. There's nothing wrong with buying things online. It is sometimes the most convenient and easy way to have access to healthy foods. So the other thing to know when it comes to farro is that naturally there's going to be a little bit of a white powdery coating on it that you can see if you look really carefully. We're going to want to rinse that off just because that could add a little bit of bitterness for some folks if we leave it on there. Plus, it is possible in the manufacturing with any whole grain that there's going to be a little bit of debris left over. So we want to make sure we're rinsing it off and we're starting fresh. So I'm going to be measuring the amount I want, and for this I'm going to cook 1 cup of farro. We get to eye level. Yep, that looks good. That is the amount that I want to have. See, 1 cup. I'm going to go rinse my farro at the sink. I'll be back. Now, a little bit of a bonus tip. If you really like that nutty, rich flavor in any of your grains, what you can do is actually toast the dry farro first. But in order to do this, you want to rinse it off, pat it dry with a paper towel, and then you can put it at the bottom of your pot before you start boiling any water. You toast it 3 to 4 minutes, turn that heat up to about medium, and make sure you're paying attention to it, because if you're not looking carefully, it could burn very quickly. But this will add so much dimension to your farro. I promise it's delicious. But because I'm shorter on time today, I'm going to skip that step, and I jumped right into the boiling. Okay, now we can see that our water is at a rolling boil. We're going to add that farro in, reduce the heat to a simmering boil. Now, because this is going to be cooked more like a pasta than a rice, we actually are going to leave this boiling, but lid off. We're going to have put that inside. That is going to need to come back up to a boil, and we're going to let that to the side and set the timer for about 35 minutes, and then we'll check it. Now, what we're going to do is once this farro has boiled and we're at the end, that's when we're going to be adding in all of our flavorings. We don't want to do it now because we're going to be straining off all of the water from the cooking farro. So we don't want to be straining off all of those wonderful flavors that we added in from herbs or spices. And that differs from making a rice, where you might want to add the spices and even some oil right in the beginning, because that rice is going to absorb all of the water that you add and you're not straining it off at the end. Okay, my timer just went off. We're going to check the farro now to see if it's done. And the way to test that is by taking a little bite. It's going to be very hot, so I have to blow on it first. But we want the chewiness, the bite of it, to almost be like an al dente pasta. So let's check it out. Now we can see that most of the water has been absorbed, not quite all of it, and we're going to strain off the rest of it. But I'm going to just take a bite of these little kernels to see how done it is. Perfect. I will strain this water off in the sink over there, and we will come back. All right, our farro is done cooking, and you can see it's fluffed up quite a bit. There's a lot of volume in here, but it expanded, I would say, about 3 times the size of it originally. All right, now we're gonna turn our attention to the glycemic index and how blood sugar and carbohydrate foods like whole grains affect our health. We're going to go over one of the biggest debates in nutrition, and that is carbs, and more specifically, the glycemic index and what this means for you. So let's dive in. We're gonna start with the basics. To fuel itself, our body needs to extract glucose from foods. Now, foods are complex in the way that they are, but generally we like to classify these into three main categories. And these are our macronutrients, and they are sources of fat, carbohydrate, and protein. Now, truthfully, energy can be extracted from all three of these types of macronutrients, but carbs give us the most direct source of energy for our bodies compared to protein or fat. And carbs do this by giving us a source of glucose. Fats and proteins happen to have a little bit more complex chemistry going on when it comes to getting energy from them. So in reality, it is just much easier to use carbohydrates as energy for our bodies overall. Usually, we refer to foods as being either a carb, a fat, or a protein. In other words, foods falling into one of their macronutrient categories. But that's not really how it works in reality. Make a note to yourself that most foods are kind of complex in their nature, and they probably have at least two, if not all three, of the macronutrients in them. We're going to return to this concept later. Now, why is it that carbs can be considered the best source of fuel for our body? Let's break this down in very simple terms. So they are the preferred source of fuel or energy for our body because ultimately everything's going to get broken down into a form of energy that our cells can use. And this cell energy is called ATP. Now, the chain of events is that carbohydrates become glucose and glucose becomes ATP. And then our cells use that ATP to do their metabolism and all of the chemistry that they need to do. So given this direct chain of events, glucose can be considered a very direct source of energy for our cells. And understanding the specific reasons why this is would require us to dig deep into biochemistry and learning all of the different metabolic pathways like glycolysis, the TCA or the Krebs cycle, the electron transport chain, gluconeogenesis, and so much more. And that is some nitty-gritty heavy science stuff. I don't believe any of that is necessary for you to know how you can be healthy. You can leave all that science stuff to us health professionals. Now, many of you watching right now may be wondering how keto plays into all of this. So you may have heard something about the keto diet or ketone bodies themselves. While we're not going to discuss ketogenesis in this video or ketone metabolism, understand that our body does have backup methods to get energy for our cells if glucose is not around, and ketone bodies are one of these backup sources of fuel. So let's get back to our carb story. When it comes to carbohydrate foods, not all are created equal. And here is where we finally introduce the idea of glycemic index, which is a way to classify carbohydrate foods based on their quality. Now, before describing what the glycemic index is, we need to understand how this framework came to be and how it got created. This will help us understand if the glycemic index is good or not good for us to use. So here's the deal. Because blood sugar is so important for our overall health, nutritionists and researchers have created a way for us to understand different foods and how they're going to impact our blood sugar. And this is called the glycemic impact. Now, nutrition advice used to be to think of foods only in terms of what molecules are inside of them. But it turns out this doesn't really give us the whole story, and I would argue is actually a somewhat misleading way to think about food and nutrition, especially carbohydrate metabolism. So one way this story was often told in the past, and is still told by some people, including some doctors, is by stating that, for example, two different foods that are completely different have the same amount of sugar in them, so they must be equal. A common example that you might hear is that a chocolate bar has the same amount of sugar as a cup of grapes. Now, this, in my opinion, is extremely problematic and confusing for people. It is misleading and can honestly be a dangerous way to understand nutrition and food science. So with newer research and a bit of a better understanding about how all of this stuff works, the idea became, instead of thinking of our foods in terms of simply the molecules that make them up, we need to think about foods in terms of how they are broken down in our body and how they are actually metabolized. And this is why the glycemic impact was created. So now that we understand the background story of the glycemic impact and its approach, let's break down what it is. But first, please subscribe, because if this video is useful for you, I'm sure there are other people out there who are also going to find it very useful. And the more subs we have, the more people can get access to these videos. So the glycemic impact is a scoring system for evaluating how foods affect our blood sugar. And it comes in two different varieties. The first is the glycemic index. It is an artificial number that looks at the ease to which our bodies can break down a food into simple glucose and increase our blood sugar. So a food with a high score is considered a high glycemic index food, and this This means that it's broken down faster and more easily into sugar, and in turn will increase our blood sugar faster. This is versus a low glycemic index food, which in turn is going to be broken down more slowly and thus increase our blood sugar more slowly, or increase our blood sugar less overall. Now, the second variety of glycemic impact is the glycemic load. Now, the glycemic load takes into account the glycemic index of a food in the context of that actual food. So it's really looking at how easy it is for your body to break down a food into sugar, but it also considers how much sugar overall is in that food per the amount that you'd normally eat. So a perfect example of this is watermelon. Watermelon is a very high glycemic index food because it is simply broken down into sugar very easily in the digestive process. But in fact, watermelon, for the amount a person would normally eat in one sitting, is a very low glycemic load food, meaning for about a cup or 2 cups of watermelon, there's actually not that much sugar in it overall. So some foods can be high glycemic index and low glycemic load at the same time. And alternatively, we might have a food that has a low glycemic index, but a high glycemic load at the same time. These two really go hand in hand. So what's good about this system? Well, it puts blood sugar at the front and center of our focus on thinking about what foods we want to be eating. And we know this is extremely important for our metabolic health, and especially for folks who have diabetes. So it simply is targeting the direct element that is the most important when considering what to eat for somebody who might have some trouble with regulating their blood sugar. But there are some issues with this approach. The first issue is that glucose response and blood sugar is impacted by many more elements beyond just the glycemic index or the glycemic load of a food. Some of these factors include the quality of the food source, the quantity of the food source, the overall nutrient composition of that food and how caloric it is, the acid levels of our body, the processing and cooking method of that food, just to name a few. The second issue with this approach is that we eat real food, not molecules. So the artificial scores or numbers on individual foods is really skewing our perception of how a whole meal is impacting our blood sugar and our health. We almost always are eating multiple types of foods together. And this blends right into issue number 3, which is that we often eat whole meals, not individual foods. And meals are complex in their makeup. And of course, our blood sugar is impacted by many things beyond carbohydrates themselves. So if you've seen any of my other videos, you've probably heard me talk about something called the healthy trifecta. And what is the healthy trifecta? Well, quite simply, it's a framework for thinking about what a healthy and balanced meal should look like, or a healthy and balanced snack. And that is incorporating fiber, healthy fat, and protein are all together going to slow down the blood sugar spike after your meal. And we know that slowing down our blood sugar increase is really important for our metabolic health. Now, a fourth issue with the glycemic impact approach is the other side of the equation. And this is how insulin is responding. In other words, the insulin index. Now, when it comes to blood sugar chemistry, it's really all about how our body responds to blood sugar increasing. We do not want our blood sugar to be too high for too long. So what that looks like is that after we eat a meal, that food is getting broken down into sugar, and that sugar is getting shunted into our blood so it can go around to the cells of our body. But for our body to really be able to use that sugar for fuel, it needs to enter inside of our cells. And the way it can enter our cells is from a hormone called insulin. So we need insulin to be at the correct amounts at the correct time to make sure everything is coordinated and working according to plan. So many people argue that measuring the glycemic index of a food or a meal without also measuring the insulin index is pretty useless to get an overall picture of how our food is impacting our overall metabolism. And this article, which I'm going to link for you in the description below, summarizes this process pretty well. So you might be wondering, well, what is my take on all of this? I'm gonna be really frank. I dislike this system. I think in general, giving number scores to foods really overall overcomplicates the whole process of healthy eating. Eating is a primal experience and is something I'd argue needs to be experienced in our body, not just in our brains. We can get way too cerebral with thinking about healthy food and nutrition. And that's really important because overall, eating and spending time at meals should be an enjoyable process. But let's be clear, there is more than one way of framing a healthy diet and healthy eating and healthy carbohydrates. The glycemic index is just one of many. Another framework for evaluating the quality of carbohydrate foods and how that impacts our health is the simple versus complex carbohydrate framework. And I talk about that in this video over here on pasta. But ask yourself right now, why are we even bothering with trying to understand glycemic glycemic index, the carbohydrate quality, or any carbohydrate framework? Well, in general, thinking about carbohydrates and carb-containing foods is going to change depending on our personal goals. Are we an athlete? Do we have diabetes? Are we trying to lose weight? Now, if health is your main goal, then I cannot recommend enough digging your heels into learning about one of the most evidence-based and delicious approaches to healthy eating and lifestyle. And that's the Mediterranean diet, which I break down in a really easy series for you to get started today. Jump into those videos if you're ready. Okay, let's discuss a little bit about gluten and a gluten-free Mediterranean diet approach. I've recently been asked this question: can the Mediterranean diet be gluten-free? In this video, you'll learn whether or not we can adapt the Mediterranean diet to make it gluten-free while still maintaining the nutritional quality. So when deciding whether or not the Mediterranean diet can be gluten-free, here's what we're dealing with. This diet is famous for its inclusion of whole grains, including wheat and wheat varieties, barley, rye, pasta, couscous, and other ancient grains. But if you can't eat all of these grains because they have gluten in them, maybe it's because you have celiac disease, a gluten allergy, or an intolerance or a sensitivity, then you might assume that the Mediterranean diet is not going to work for you. Well, this is false. I'd argue that you can absolutely adapt this diet to meet your gluten-free needs. And I'll break down how to do that right now. So it's important that we first answer the question: what is gluten and why is it so problematic? Gluten is a protein that's found in a lot of grains naturally, and this includes grains like wheat, barley, and rye. And the properties of gluten add a sort of stretchiness to a lot of these grains. So think of this in terms of pizza dough. Pizza dough, which is made often from flour that comes from wheat, is very stretchy and malleable. Picture a pizza chef tossing that dough in the air to make it a large round circle. If that dough did not have gluten in it, it wouldn't stretch so easily and likely would just rip apart. So gluten can be thought of as very helpful in its culinary aspect. But in some cases, people have a huge difficulty with consuming this substance. Someone may experience mild symptoms like fatigue, gas or bloating, an alternating constipation or diarrhea, or even brain fog. But in other cases, those symptoms could be more severe, like accidental weight loss, malnutrition, or even intestinal damage. Now, the causes of these symptoms can vary depending on what the actual issue is underlying. In the case of celiac disease, someone is going to experience an autoimmune reaction to gluten. So every time they eat gluten, their own immune cells start attacking it as a threat. In other cases, like an allergy response, they're going to get an allergic type of reaction, which can range in its symptom picture from having lung issues, skin issues, or digestive issues. And then in other cases, it's not really clear, but some people just feel worse when they eat gluten. So given that gluten is not an essential nutrient for our body, it's not a vitamin or a mineral, it definitely can be eliminated from a diet so that someone can avoid the negative symptoms they feel. However, it should be noted that gluten has gotten a lot of bad press in the last years, and some of this might be causing more confusion than is necessary. Here's my take on it. If you're concerned about gluten, I suggest that you talk to your doctor or a dietitian about your concerns. It's possible that avoiding gluten and gluten products will help you feel better and resolve your symptoms, but it's possible that it's not the gluten that's causing the symptoms you feel. What is unfortunate is when people start to avoid gluten because it's sort of trendy or they feel like it's going to give them some sort of health benefit. But in turn, they're reducing their overall intake of grains, especially whole grains, which are otherwise healthy foods that provide us some of the best sources of fiber in our diet overall. That being said, if you know that gluten is a problem for you and you must follow a gluten-free diet, then let's dive into how you can do this according to the Mediterranean diet approach to eating. But first, please subscribe and join our healthy community, and that's going to help us get these videos out to more people who really deserve to learn this information. All right, let's start by first clarifying a really important point. The Mediterranean diet and the Mediterranean approach to eating is not a black and white restrictive style of eating. In general, there are no rules to restrict entirely any specific food. Instead, the emphasis is on increasing certain foods that are known to give us a lot of health health benefit, like foods that are rich in vitamins and minerals, fiber, healthy fats, and protein, and instead decreasing the foods that are not giving us as much benefit. And these can be animal foods or animal products, processed foods, and foods with lots of added sugars and chemicals. So for the purpose of this video and the argument we're making here, we're going to focus in on the carbohydrate foods, since that is where the gluten comes from. Now, thanks to Mother Nature, we have a ton of alternative grains, pseudogreens, and seeds that can be eaten instead of the gluten-containing grains, almost in some cases like a total substitution for the typical dishes that people are going to enjoy in the Mediterranean diet. Now, my approach to dietary recommendations, whether gluten-free or not, is always to emphasize whole foods. This way, incorporating foods that are really healthful for your body and providing a lot of the essential nutrition are going to be the best things you can eat overall. So I'd argue that the best way to approach a gluten-free Mediterranean diet is to emphasize foods that are naturally gluten-free, rather than reaching for gluten-free products, which are often going to be very processed with added sugars, salts, or other chemicals to maintain their shelf stabilization. And that's really Mediterranean Diet Wellness 101. So next, let's address the foods you need to avoid if you're avoiding gluten. And finally, I'll break down for you a list of gluten-free foods that you should enjoy abundantly when following this approach. Okay, so what do you need to avoid if you're avoiding gluten? Well, the main player is wheat and wheat varieties, and there are a lot of these. Think about things like durum, einkorn, emmer, semolina, spelt, gram, you name it. There are a ton of wheat varieties and different types of ancient wheat grains. And speaking of ancient wheat grains, Pharaoh is a typical one that is enjoyed in Italy, which is a pearled grain that has a very nutty, chewy texture, but it does contain gluten. Then we have barley, rye, triticale, which is a cross between wheat and rye, and finally oats. But I need to point out that oats in and of themselves are not gluten-containing grains. It just so happens that often in the manufacturing, oats get contaminated with gluten because other gluten-containing foods are processed on the same machinery. So it's important to be on the lookout that if you're completely gluten-free, you have to check the packaging for things like oats. Now, let's talk about the foods to include when following a gluten-free diet. And here I want to emphasize a very important point, and that is to expand our understanding and our thinking about grains to also include pseudograins and seeds. The truth is, carbohydrates in our diet do not have to only come from classical grains. And in general, the more variety that we have in our diet, likely the better off we usually are. And this is because it helps boost our overall nutrient intake and keeps us from getting bored. All right, here's my list of gluten-free grains, pseudograins, and seeds that can be enjoyed abundantly on the Mediterranean diet. We have amaranth, arrowroot, buckwheat, which, note, this is a misnomer. It's actually not a type of wheat. It just has wheat in its name. Corn, which of course can come in many varieties, like cornmeal, grits, polenta are often the ways it's enjoyed. Then we have flaxseed, lots of gluten-free flours, which can be flours from rice, soy, corn, potato, or even bean flours. Then we have millet, which is a seed, quinoa, a pseudograin that also contains a good bit of protein. We have rice and every kind of rice variety, sorghum, soy, tapioca that comes from cassava root, and teff. So as you can see, if you want to follow a gluten-free diet, there is no shortage of choices and variety that can be enjoyed abundantly on the Mediterranean diet. Now, all you need to do is cook your gluten-free grains, pseudograins, or seeds and pair them with healthy fats and proteins to achieve what I argue is the most balanced meal. And that is one that contains the healthy trifecta. I talk about this in many of my videos, but eating healthy fats, fiber, and protein all together is really going to help slow down the digestion, which we know is better for our blood sugar and overall nutrient extraction. Plus, it's going to make you feel a lot better when you're eating. And this is not only important while you're eating, but important for the many hours after a meal where you want to maintain your energy levels. And if this mega guide on whole grains wasn't enough information for you and you're ready for more, jump into my complete guide up here where I give you meal ideas for every meal of the day according to Mediterranean diet principles. Jump into that video and I'll see you in there.